I think if everybody could take their seats, I think we'll get started. We got a few people in the back. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Jennifer Winters, the director of Bing Nursery School, and it's certainly my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight. I really like to start out by welcoming I've met so many former teachers and staff people from Bing Nursery School, and along with our own staff people, I really think they're the heart and soul of Bing for the last 50 years. So if you could take a minute and if you could stand up, if you were somehow involved at Bing at any one point, we'd love to see you. That's amazing. So really on this anniversary of Bing, we really are inspired and continue to be inspired by the wisdom of Edith Dowley, our founding director. And with that, I want to also do a shout out to the Dowley family who, I think there's maybe 10 of them here tonight. So thank you very much for coming. So this evening, we are very pleased to co-present this event with the Stanford Historical Society, whose mission is really to encourage the study and understanding of Stanford University's history and ideas of the university's founders. Our program tonight is entitled How the Grandest Child Care Experiment in American History Inspired Edith Dowley and Shaped Bing Nursery School. Our speaker tonight is the very talented and accomplished writer, Christine VanDeVelde. Christine is a journalist and an author whose work has appeared in the New York Times, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, Self, and Parenting. I could go on. She has co-authored the bestseller, College Admission from Application to Acceptance, Step by Step, and she is currently at work on a book about Bing Nursery School. So if there is ever a person that is best suited to write a book on Bing Nursery School, it would be Christine. So Christine first came to Bing when her daughter, Warwick, was enrolled in the 2-year-old class some 20 years ago. As a parent, she was very generous with both her time and her talent. And in 1999, she began writing a series of articles that highlighted the work of Stanford's world-renowned faculty in psychology and education for our annual publication, the Bing Times. These outstanding articles so eloquently captured the work, beginning with Professor Albert Bandura and including Professors Eleanor Maccabee, Robert Zion, Mark Lepper, John Gabrielli, Carol Dweck, Laura Carstensen, and Deborah Stipek. And if you're interested in ever reading any of those articles, they're actually online and can be found on our Bing website. Christine has also written many articles about Bing that have been published in local magazines. Christine is a scholar, a researcher, an author, and a longtime friend of Bing and supporter of Bing. Her love of literature contributed by starting and building the Bing Children's Library, which is enjoyed by hundreds of young children each week. As we celebrate Bing's 50th anniversary, it seems only fitting that a book detailing Bing's origin, founding, and place in the field of early childhood education and child development is being written. For all of us who are interested and have been involved in Bing and in early childhood education, there is no better person able to tell the fascinating story and provide a historical perspective to the events and ideas from which Bing evolved and which, to this day, keeps it going. So thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Christine VanDeVelde.
Thank you, first of all, to the Stanford Historical Society for inviting me to speak tonight about one of my favorite things. And thank you also to Bing Nursery School, and in particular, Jennifer Winters and Beth Wise, and to the family of Edith Dowley, who have been so helpful in making me understand the remarkable story of the school's founder. Full disclosure, I believe the world would be a better place if every child could go to Bing. And I know this is true because one of the luckiest things that ever happened to me as a parent is that shortly before my daughter's second birthday, I got a call that she had been admitted. So on January 10th, 1992, holding my daughter's hand, we walked through the doors of Bing. It was California winter weather, sunny and mild, with the temperature hovering in the 1950s, and I remember exactly what she wore. She had on Levi's overalls, a red polka dot turtleneck, and a cotton sweater that was embroidered with daisies. To this day, I can barely talk about it without tearing up, as you can see. I had always loved school, and here it was, her first day of play yards and learning and friends. I was excited for her, but I was also nervous. This was the first step that she was taking out into the wider world. Up until that time, my husband and I were the ones who had shaped her, her words and her interests and her world down to what she ate and every person in it. And we had kept her safe and loved, but now other people would have a hand in that. What I didn't know, though, was that the hands I was putting her into that day were the hands every parent would wish for the first time their child walked through a school door. They were the hands and open arms of Edith Dowley, the founder of Bing Nursery School. Though she passed away in 1988, the year before my daughter was born, Edith, as she is always referred to, is to this day a palpable presence at Bing. More than one teacher has said to me, "I didn't know Edith Dowley, but I know that woman." And when Assistant Director Beth Wise moved into her office, she hung a portrait of Edith high above her desk. She wanted, she said, to look up and see it every day so that she would always be reminded of Edith and what she set out to do when she helped to found Bing. More than 50 years earlier, turned out in one of her fashionable suits with her hair perfectly coiffed, Edith insisted a group of architects get down on their knees, the better to view the world as a 3-year-old would. There, using a child's wooden blocks, she laid out her vision of Bing Nursery School, physically and spiritually fleshing out the walls and the windows and the play yards and the principles that inform and animate what happens in the classroom still today. Bing Nursery School was the culmination of Edith's carefully constructed worldview. And tonight I'm going to tell you the story of that worldview. It begins with her upbringing and her own education, but really the most significant influence is the role she played in what I like to call the grandest experiment in childcare this country has ever seen. Edith was born in 1910 in New York City, the second of 5 children for Michael and Nora Dowley, who had emigrated 5 years earlier from Ireland. And that is little Edith right there. During the early years of Edith's life, the family moved steadily west across the country to accommodate her father's work in the retail dry goods business, and his resume reads like a kind of history of department stores' early days: Wanamaker, B. Altman, William A. French, J.L. Hudson. By 1915, the family had settled in Denver, Colorado. Denver's schools were among the first in the country to have kindergartens, so at age 4.5, Edith attended what she later recalled must have been a real Froebel kindergarten, referring to the German educator who championed preschool. For those unfamiliar with Froebel, and I doubt there are very many in this room, but he was a German education reformer who believed in preschool education at a time, the mid-1800s, when most children by the age of 5 had gone to work in textile mills and mines or in wealthy households as maids and nannies. His ideas that play was an essential activity, that children should be allowed to freely explore their interests, and that the role of the teacher was not to indoctrinate, but to encourage children's self-expression, became widely embraced in this country when they were adopted by John Dewey, who had founded the University of Chicago Laboratory School around the turn of the 20th century. For Edith Dowley, her Froebel kindergarten was, she later said, the most wonderful place in my life. It was a good place that said, "Come on in, you'll like it, and it will like you." She said she didn't remember much about her kindergarten teachers from the waist up, but she remembered that they wore long skirts and moved around the room very quietly and created a beautiful environment. Edith's kindergarten classrooms actually laid the first bricks in the foundation of her future. In a later interview, she said, "It sounded nice, it smelled nice, it looked nice, it was quiet, and it was comfortable. That told me that I wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. I remember telling my father that, and he said, maybe you will." But at Detroit's Marygrove College, Edith majored in English and took 3 minors to cover all her bases, she said: philosophy, journalism, and library science. A small, all-girls Catholic liberal arts college, Marygrove had the added advantage of being close to her family, who were now living in Detroit. The Dowleys were known for their warm home life and were exceptionally close. I can now personally attest that that tradition continues among the Dowley family. In fact, Edith would reside with her parents and her sister Alice throughout most of her life. Edith was also a devout Catholic, whose faith would remain important to her. And these two influences, family and faith, were very much in evidence, according to those who knew her, in her life and in her teaching. Bonnie Chandler, who was hired by Edith and taught at Bing for more than 30 years, described Edith's teachings as both educationally sound and deeply instructive in a moral sense. According to Bonnie, there was no human being who was outside her realm of caring. The child who acted out, or the adult who hadn't quite solved all their problems, she still encircled with love and appreciation, and she helped surround them with the kind of attitude that would allow them to grow to the next phase. More than one person has described Edith to me as a joyous person. Just being near her made you feel good. Also, multiple people described how children reacted to Edith, which was usually to run straight at her and jump into her arms. Friends of Edith said you also, if you were on the Stanford campus, you always wanted to go to the party with her because she was swarmed by people. Later in life, when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, she was in the hospital, and one of the doctors asked psychology professor Alberta Siegel, "Who is this woman? I've never seen so many flowers." A prolific poet and writer in college, for a while Edith thought she would pursue a publishing career. But when she graduated from college in 1932, the economy was touching bottom in the Depression. We all know what happened. 10,000 banks had closed, 13 million people were unemployed. So faced with the most difficult job market in the country's history, Edith did what many young people still do today when faced with tough economic times. She went back to school. But this time she headed in a different direction from publishing because of the birth of her brother George. Baby George fascinated 20-year-old Edith. She spent hours playing with him, read all of the child development literature, signed up for classes in psychology and genetics. George's birth revived her interest in young children and their education. And by the way, baby George's wife and some of his children and grandchildren are in the audience with us tonight. Advised to further study child development, Edith looked to Detroit's Merrill Palmer Institute, one of the first institutes of child development in the United States. The school was an early pioneer in research, and their laboratory nursery school served as a model for decades. Later, her Stanford colleagues would credit her time at Merrill Palmer with fostering her superb ability to integrate research into an education program, which is, of course, one of the defining characteristics of Bing. Edith's plans to change course and enroll at Merrill Palmer, however, were temporarily derailed when, as she was applying, she asked the Merrill Palmer registrar, "What exactly is a nursery school? I've never heard of that term." Well, most people had not heard of a nursery school in 1932, but Edith later admitted this was somewhat a foolish question to ask, and we'll never know, but possibly as a result, she was denied admission. Luckily for us, she persevered and was admitted the following year. But she later said, "They told me I probably wouldn't do very well because liberal arts was not the introduction to go into this work. The leading research interest of the day was physical growth and development, with studies measuring head circumference and blood pressure as opposed to a child's likelihood and speed with which they ate a marshmallow. Despite this, by the end of the year, Edith was offered scholarships to pursue a master's in child development at University of Michigan, Iowa State, and Mills College. She again opted to stay close to home and enrolled at University of Michigan. She had an assistantship to work in the nursery school and kindergarten at the university's lab school, earning $350 for the year. And this is where she stayed for 9 years. Edith was, by temperament, an ally of an advocate for the progressive idea of child-centered education. When she was doing her practice teaching in the Detroit Public Schools, she later wrote of her supervising teacher, "All she did was to be a strict disciplinarian, teach according to the handbook or the set of rules. And one day I said to myself, let me out of here, I'll lose my mind. I can't stand this curtailing of freedom. I don't believe in it for the children, and I don't believe in it for me." Asked to teach first grade at the lab school, Edith brought that empathy and passion to the classroom. She set it up like an advanced version of nursery school, with centers of interest that allowed children the freedom to come and go among activities. Sounds familiar, right? Like the Bing classroom. She resisted getting a basic reading text and instead experimented. For example, she took the children on walks and wrote experience stories with them. And again, sound familiar? One of my treasures from my daughter's years at Bing was the experience stories that she dictated to the teachers there. One of the strengths of Edith's personality was that she didn't come into situations with preconceived ideas, hence no reading text. Bonnie Chandler said of her that she had strong ethics, but was a very fresh person, so she acted without being too cluttered with the past, even though her ideas were very deeply felt. So at Merrill Palmer and University of Michigan, Edith's intuitions, informed by her upbringing and her own schooling, were beginning to mature into principles and were on the way to becoming the practice that would eventually inform what happens at Bing. In the next phase of her life, history would shape and sharpen those principles, enlarge her worldview, and put her on the path to Stanford. In the spring of 1943, Edith was 33 years old in her 9th year of teaching at University of Michigan. The United States had been at war for more than a year. England was the last country standing against Germany and Europe, but the invasion of Normandy was still a year away. In the Pacific, a long series of battles had begun against the Japanese across the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Depression was forgotten with the economy galvanized by the war effort. And Rosie the Riveter was everywhere, including Norman Rockwell's portrait of her on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. In Portland, Oregon that spring, industrialist Henry Kaiser, the father of modern shipbuilding, hosted an informal dinner for the men who worked in his shipyards. Those yards produced the Liberty and Victory ships and the AP-5 attack transports that comprised what was known as the Bridge of Ships. This was an almost unbroken line of ships carrying troops and warplanes and food and fuel, ammunition and medicine to the fighting fronts. Toward the end of the dinner, one of the men asked, "Is there any truth in the rumor we'll be running at 40% women next year, or in the yards?" And Kaiser's son Edgar responded, "That's not rumor, that's fact." And that response elicited a groan across the dining room. In 1942 alone, the number of working women in Oregon had tripled. Women entered the workforce out of patriotism, out of economic necessity after a decade of Depression austerity, and because they were essential to the war effort, replacing the men who had joined the armed forces. In 1943, there were 14,000 women in the Kaiser shipyards, and half of them were mothers, and 1/3 of those had children between the ages of 1 and 6. But absenteeism in the Kaiser shipyards for women was running 50% higher than it was for the men. The reason? Women didn't have childcare. Almost all of them had moved across the country far from their families who might have looked after their children. Women's solutions to the problem were sometimes creative but alarming. One graveyard shift mother tied a rope around her waist and anchored it to her son so that he could play while she slept during the day. Children were left to literally roam neighborhoods by themselves. They were locked unattended in cars outside the shipyards. They were left in all-night movie theaters while their mother worked these 8-hour shifts. One woman left her 20-month-old with the bellhop in the hotel where she was staying and returned home to find him drunk and the child unattended. So when childcare arrangements weren't there or fell through, women ran late, left early, or didn't show up at all. But there were simply not enough women without children to meet the need for labor. And literally every day the launch of a ship was delayed meant lost lives on the warfront. So at Kaiser's dinner that evening, one of the supervisors or superintendents spoke up. He said, "For Pete's sake, give us some sort of a setup to relieve the domestic situation." I love that, the domestic situation. Kaiser's response was, "If the women are worried about the kids, we'll look after them. We'll build nurseries, the best in the world." The plan was not without controversy. It would require Kaiser's shrewd and hard-charging business sense and Eleanor Roosevelt to get it done. Historically, daycare had been associated with relief and poverty or charity and orphanages. Mothers really balked at the idea of leaving their children with strangers. And the government's attitude was ambivalent. Despite the need for women in the wartime workforce, agencies like the Children's Bureau and the U.S. Office of Education frowned upon it, saying it was a danger to parental authority, particularly the mother-child relationship. Social workers in particular fought the idea of public daycare tooth and nail. Nevertheless, in 1942, the federal government allocated federal funds for childcare, and in 1943, the Lanham Act provided funding for the building of daycare centers in war boom communities. But Kaiser didn't want to wait for a committee. He didn't want to wait for the complicated requirements of any kind of federal funds. So he applied for funding directly from the Maritime Commission, arguing that daycare centers were essential to the shipyard's production schedule. And luckily, he had the First Lady in his corner. The day after the dinner where he announced he would build these nursery schools, she arrived in Portland. A longtime advocate for women in the workforce, she had watched more than 3 million women go to work between 1940 and 1942, and she is really stepping up her campaign for adequate childcare for these women. She was amazed at the breadth of the project that the Kaisers were contemplating. So 2 months later, in June of 1943, when their plans were finalized, Kaiser and his son Edgar took them directly to the First Lady, who urged the Maritime Commission to give the Kaisers the go-ahead signal. And this is what an editorial in the Salem Statesman had to say. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt finally had her way. Down at Kaisertown, originally known as Portland, the government is going to spend $1 million building nurseries for children of mothers who work in the shipyards. The State Committee on Child Care opposed this plan, but Eleanor prevailed with the Maritime Commission, so the job is ordered. This has been the Russian system of child care, and we don't like it. Isn't it kind of reassuring to know that political rhetoric has, a long history? Kaiser, meanwhile, and I so admire this, brought the same zeal and the same enormous scale to the construction of a nursery school that he had brought to shipbuilding. The Kaiser shipyards had reduced construction time on the cargo and transport ships that were this lifeline to America's fighting fronts to an average of 45 days from the industry standard of 230. Ultimately, Kaiser would produce 455 ships, more than any other shipyard in the country, and he did it faster than any other shipyard in the country, at one point launching 1 ship a day. Kaiser's son Edgar took on the child care project, a hallmark of what came to be known as the Kaiser philosophy about the care of children was concern and attention to the highest quality. So when it came to staffing, it was a search for who knew the most, who can do the job best, who were the best people in the country. For Kaiser, the best started with Dr. Lois Meek Stolz, former director of the Child Development Institute at Columbia and founding director of the Institute of Child Welfare at UC Berkeley. She came on board as consultant and overall director, but she didn't want to move to Portland because her husband was based here in the Bay Area. So she tapped one of her former students at Columbia, Dr. James L. Himes Sr., to become the on-site director, after a well-placed phone call from Henry Kaiser got him released from his job at the Pentagon. So with Stolz and Himes on board, Kaiser gave them 2 months to hire staff, equip the centers, and open the doors. This is in wartime. Amy Kesselman wrote a wonderful history of women shipyard workers called Fleeting Opportunities, and she had this to say, which I think is so marvelous. For a brief moment in history, the competitive principles of the marketplace were applied to the historically underfunded profession of early childhood education. Kaiser expediters rode herd on blocks and easels and bibs and sand toys, and Stolz and Himes assumed that they would pay the nursery school teachers the going rate. But when Stolz told Henry Kaiser the figure, he exploded and he said, "You can't pay college graduates that. You won't hold them a week. Every administrative office in the yard will steal them away from you." Remember Edith Dowley's starting salary at University of Michigan? $350 a year. Head teachers at the Kaiser Shipyard Children's Center were paid an annual salary of $5,000. But how to find candidates? Travel during wartime to interview applicants was absolutely out of the question. So Stolz and Himes came up with the plan of sending 2-page telegrams to every university in the country that trained teachers in early childhood. And they were looking for a teacher professionals with degrees in early childhood development specifically, and with at least 2 years of experience. And the telegrams went on at length about the novel location of the centers, the kind of wartime urgency, their dramatic size, and this Kaiser commitment to the highest standards. Himes in an interview later said that these 2-page telegrams caused quite a bit of excitement on college campuses when they arrived. 100 teachers responded, and Edith Dowley was one of them. At the Kaiser Centers, Edith would supervise 7 groups of children aged 18 months to 3 years. So in November of 1943, just 7 months after Henry Kaiser declared he would build nursery schools for the women shipyard workers, 2 Kaiser Child Service Centers opened their doors. Designed by prominent Portland architects, Wolf and Phillips, the centers were built overlooking Oregon's Willamette River, which you can just kind of see there, and that actually is one of the child service centers. They were also located, as you can see, right at the entrance to the shipyards. So this was done to make pickup and drop-off most convenient, but it also caused some concern because there had been some minor enemy incursions on the West Coast at the beginning of the war. And there were fears about locating a center for children at the very entrance to a wartime industry that might be the target of an enemy attack. And luckily, the passing of time eased those fears for everyone. The design of the centers was truly innovative, despite the fact, or maybe because, Wolf and Phillips had never designed a nursery school. There were no other nursery schools at the time even to use as a model and study. Most daycare facilities were in people's homes, unused elementary school space, church basements. Merrill Palmer's model nursery school was in the mansion of a former railroad car manufacturer, and the University of Michigan's nursery school was in a former art gallery. So the architects designed the school like a wagon wheel that did several things. It allowed a maximum of light while creating a secluded central court, which you can see, for outdoor play. And that was essential for a school located right in the middle of a heavy industrial area. This is a different school. It doesn't have as many classrooms, but the school that Edith was at had 15 classrooms that radiated out from a large, grassy, central octagonal courtyard of 15 separate playgrounds, like the spokes of a wheel, connected by a central circular corridor. The interiors of the classrooms were undivided and equipped to accommodate 25 children each. The walls were originally papered in imitation pine paneling, which Stoles and Himes were just ecstatic about. They thought it was a big improvement over the institutional oatmeal gray that most classrooms had, but Edgar Kaiser hated it. He wanted the school to feel very gay and joyous, and so right before the school opened, he had everything repainted in pastel shades of blue and yellow and apricot. Counter space was built at a height convenient for the teachers, a top shelving where children could easily reach blocks and toys and art materials. Each room had its own washroom facilities with basins set low for the children and toilets built at the child side height of just 12 inches. And children's lockers were arranged like a dressing room unit with hooks for coats and hats and a bin for your rubber boots and a shelf for prized possessions, just as they are today. But think of this, at this time, there were no other nursery schools really. So all of this was custom. You know, now we say, oh, a cubby, and you can probably open a catalog and find a place to buy 10 different kinds of cubbies. At this point, no, you know, they had to design and build a cubby. They had to design and build a 12-inch high toilet. So I think that's so fascinating. And the other thing that struck me when I first saw these photographs was that there very little to distinguish them from Bing Nursery School's classrooms, except the clothing that the children are wearing. Every classroom, as you can see, also had 2 walls of windows, and those overlooked the shipyards so that children could curl up on the window seats and see where their mothers worked. And it must have been a breathtaking view of trucks and cranes and these cargo ships under construction, because think of it, these ships were as tall as a 30-story building and half as wide as a football field. Because the rainy season lasts 9 or 10 months a year in Portland, covered porches equipped with jungle gyms and climbing boxes adjoined the classrooms that led out to each of the designated yards, again allowing children to play outdoors every day of the year. And during better weather, children could splash in one of the 4 wading pools in the center of the courtyard's wagon wheel design, right there. Almost 25 years later, Edith Dowley would incorporate many of these ideas into the design of Bing Nursery School. A designated playground for each classroom, cupboards built at the child's height so they didn't have to ask for things, high windows that bathed the room in natural light, covered porches so children could play outside year-round, walls and furniture painted in cheerful pastel colors, and even a central atrium similar to the enclosed courtyard. Bing doesn't have wading pools, but it has sand pits, which on any given day can be found to have been populated with watering holes of some kind. Edith was part of an unprecedented brain trust at these centers. There were Stoles and Himes, 100 teachers, 6 group supervisors with advanced degrees and years of experience, 10 nurses, 5 nutritionists, and 2 family consultants. Out of that brain trust came a wellspring of ideas about how best to serve children and their families. An infirmary staffed by a nurse was available every day for children who were mildly ill or below par physically. There weren't enough physicians in the Portland area, so the centers made available immunizations for smallpox and tetanus and whooping cough, and in the first year alone, over 3,000 immunizations were administered in the centers. A fully equipped kitchen supplied every child with all the food he needs during his stay at the center, including his daily requirement of cod liver oil. Dr. Miriam Lowenberg, who would later collaborate with Dr. Benjamin Spock on the bestseller Feeding Your Baby and Child, was brought in as head nutritionist. And meals and snacks for the teachers and children were delivered to each classroom via large heated rolling carts, and children dined as a family, eating 5 to a table with their teacher. This is Edith again. dining with her students. One day's typical lunch featured liver loaf, creamed onions, buttered potatoes, crisp raw carrots, milk, and for dessert, a creamy rice and fig pudding. Lowenberg also saw another innovation at the centers, home service food. On a trip to England, Eleanor Roosevelt had seen women war workers pick up their evening meals at the end of their shifts, and she suggested that the Kaiser Centers offer this service. So menus went home weekly, and when mothers picked up their children, their evening meal would be waiting for pickup as well. On Wednesday, March 15th, 1944, the meal included fresh salmon loaf and lemon and avocado gelatin salad for 50 cents a portion. And the list of amenities goes on. There was a lending library for children's books, a small commissary that sold things like combs and toothbrushes and shoelaces. There was a mending service where parents could bring their children's torn clothing. There was a barber service for children's haircuts. There was a bi-weekly newsletter for each classroom that told parents, what the children had been up to that week. And the teachers wrote and provided free educational booklets on shopping suggestions, on clothing for children, or children in war. One visitor wrote, "I have never seen anything so remarkable. They are open 24 hours per day and are so advanced they actually beggar description." For all of this, parents paid a fee of $5 for one child and $3.75 for each additional child. The Kaiser Children's Centers were the largest nursery schools in the world. Every day, each day, they cared for over 1,000 children, about 375 children for each shift. That was day, swing, and graveyard. The teachers at Kaiser worked a 48-hour week, 50 weeks a year, because President Roosevelt had mandated a 48-hour week for all wartime industries in 1943. So to accommodate the shipyard schedule, the Kaiser Centers operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months a year, with the exception of Christmas. The center's on-site director, James Himes, was a well-known advocate of the progressive idea of child-centered education that Froebel and Dewey espoused, and he recruited young women who were committed to those ideas as well. Again, children freely exploring their interests, the development of social skills, the nurturance of a child's independence. Edith was, of course, a perfect fit. And it was here in the Kaiser Center classrooms that the philosophy that Bing lives by to this day really began to coalesce. Play took center stage in the center classrooms. Himes wrote, "These richly equipped rooms became the children's world. The children brought with them experiences from their home living, ideas that had been percolating in their minds, and used the raw materials that were in the rooms, the paints, the crayons, the blocks, the toy telephones, the toy ships. Children moved seamlessly between the playground, covered porches, and the classroom, exploring and pursuing what interested them. This freedom to run, roam, or rest, along with the freedom to decide what to do and for how long to do it, were the foundation for the first of the three principles that would become Edith's guiding philosophy at Bing. She called it the freedom of movement. If you visit the nursery school classrooms at Stanford today, you'll see children playing without interruption in the block corner, or setting up a dinosaur farm or a nursery school itself on the covered porch, or, as Bonnie Chandler once said, learning geography with their feet as they ran up and down the hills of the playground. One of her peers later said of Edith that she never supervised the children, she was one of them. She had the uncanny ability, lost to most adults, to get down to a child's level and see the world through their eyes. And that ability was put to good use with the children who came to the Kaiser Centers. The mothers who came to work at the shipyards came from many different walks of life. Some of the children had grown up in stable homes, but others had grown up in lumber and mining camps or on migrant farms and under pretty rough conditions. For example, even the very youngest children were sometimes practiced users of profanity, which boggled Edith and the other teachers' minds. Often the children arrived at the school pretty listless and malnourished, sometimes their diets having consisted mostly of handouts of bread and butter. And when they were introduced to a more balanced menu, sitting at the table in the classroom, they would moan, "Oh, my bread," as if they couldn't live without their familiar food. In the company housing, families built wood fires in the ovens of the electric stoves because they'd never seen an appliance. And children and parents didn't always know how to use toilets, and they treated them as garbage cans, throwing everything into them. So Kaiser hired social workers to basically educate families about the basics of modern living. One mother came to Edith concerned about a rash that she felt that her child had. And Edith took him to the doctor, who examined him and turned him back to Edith and said, "Just tell the mother he's filthy." Well, Edith, who was so compassionate, was not going to say that to the mother. So she went to the mother and she said, "Give the child a bath and the rash will come on fully, and then we can see what it is." And the mother came back and she said, and first of all, the mother was aghast that you would give a child a bath during the winter months. That just was not done. And so, Edith prevailed, and she came back and she said to Edith, "I gave him a bath and he didn't catch a cold, and the rash is gone." And Edith said in a later interview that she and the mother became very good friends after that. As I learned more and more about Edith, I realized she must have been a hell of a role model, because she seemed to be able to get what she wanted by being simultaneously kind and firm, which is a very, very powerful thing. Stanford professor of developmental psychology Eleanor Maccabee once described Edith as a woman who knew what she felt children needed and was not about to be deterred. So you can see that the Kaiser classroom stood in stark relief to many of the children's outside experiences. Remember Edith's kindergarten experience? She said, "It smelled nice, it looked nice, it sounded nice, it was quiet, and it was comfortable." The Kaiser classrooms were prepared for children just as you would prepare for a guest in your home, sending a message that the children were valued and that the teachers were excited that they were there. And these ideas became the basis for the second principle in Edith's philosophy: the child as honored guest. Later, when Edith designed Bing, she told the architects that everything ahead of the child, as the child entered the school, should be more important than what was left behind. Greeted individually by a teacher, the children see the classroom and the open doors to the play yard beyond laid out to perfectly suit their perspective, from the size of the furniture and the height of the windows to the placement of the easels and the hippo and the elephant staged by the watering hole in the sandpit. At Bing, Edith liked the teachers to get down on their knees and hold out their arms to the children to greet them. And again, the late Alberta Siegel, who conducted research at Bing and was also on the advisory committees for the school, once said that Edith bore the occupational stigmata of ballet dancers' legs because she was constantly dropping down to the level of the children so she could look directly into their eyes. In Oregon, Edith also became more aware of the difficulties of parenting. She described herself as feeling dismayed by the way parents responded to their children. They were often cross when they came to pick them up, and if the children didn't mind in a timely fashion, they would yell and even physically punish them. And Edith later said, "We didn't understand that a great deal of this was fatigue, that a parent who had been out on the waves in the bay all day had less patience and less reason to believe she should have patience than mothers we had seen in laboratory schools. But as we got to know them better, we understood that the problems of parenting are pretty universal. A great deal of what happens is the result of too many demands on the mother, along with the immaturity of children." One of the most important things that the teachers at the center did to mitigate those demands was to communicate with the mothers in a way that made their job easier. Every day, teachers posted messages to the parent for each child outside the classroom door: what they had eaten, how long they had slept, who they had played with, and anything unusual that had happened. And you can imagine how desperate the mothers must have been for information, having been separated from their child for 8 hours or more. But the teachers found the way they worded those messages was very important. If the teacher said, "Mary didn't eat her lunch today, she left most of it on her plate," or "Johnny didn't take a nap," the parents became very angry and punitive, scolding and yelling and even slapping the children. And Edith found they had to train teachers to say things with great tact in very positive and reassuring ways. Instead of saying, "Mary didn't eat much lunch today," they said, "Mary made a great effort to eat her lunch today. She was so cooperative." Or, "Johnny rested very quietly," instead of "he didn't go to sleep." And then the reaction of parents became sympathetic instead of overcritical. One of Edith's mantras that's still repeated to this day is, "It is the job of the teacher to make the child more attractive to the parent." And I think of this as the corollary to the principle of the child as honored guest. It started in the shipyards, but every day on the Stanford campus, when parents pick their children up at Bing, a teacher shares something positive about what their child did that day, and everybody goes home happier. It might be what a good builder he is, or what a good observer of life, or listen to what she said today. As a parent at Bing, I had no idea that I was being manipulated in this way. But I am very, very grateful for it. And to this day, I remember some of the things they said, and they were so simple, but they so buoyed you in the difficult task of parenting. Remember one time I picked my daughter up and Beth Wise said, she spent almost all day at the easel painting, and that was like a revelation. So, in one of the wonderful interviews we are lucky to have, Edith said she wanted a world for children that is designed for them, for their pleasure, for their happiness, for their learning, for their enchantment, for their challenge. She believed that nursery school should give back to children some of what the modern world had taken away. And this is achieved by giving children the gift of time, the last of the 3 principles that inform the culture and teaching at Bing. In a classroom where the child's experience is the priority, children are free to explore, supported in the hard work of making sense of the world. And one of the tasks of teachers Edith talked about was to make that hard work possible. And one of the most important and magical pathways by which children accomplish this is through dramatic play. Dramatic play often encompasses the mundane. When I was observing at the school yesterday, there was a dinosaur chase of some kind, or it might be swim lessons or other, superheroes. But it's also used by children to make sense of the traumatic. The psychologist Peter Gray has documented how children in concentration camps played a game they called gas chamber. And after 9/11, the children at Bing built towers of blocks and knocked them over and over again. Back at the University of Michigan Lab School in 1937, in the play yard of Edith's classroom, the dramatic play revolved around the aviator Amelia Earhart. When Earhart went missing in her attempt to fly around the world that summer, Edith and her first graders spent almost the whole 6-week session building a ship to search for Earhart. And the children used large floor blocks that they overlaid with paper that they had painted. And when they were done, they christened the ship with shampoo because Prohibition had not yet been repealed, which left one little boy that Edith had a long conversation with extremely unhappy. So at the Kaiser Centers, there was a lot of shipbuilding in the classroom and on the play yard. But the teachers also had to deal with the potential for real trauma and children being separated from their mothers at such early ages and for such long periods of time. Day shift children arrived at 6:15 a.m. and stayed until 4 p.m. 6 days a week. When children sat down for lunch or snack in the classroom, some refused to eat and others would eat but then would not leave the table because eating was so closely related to their mothers. Some of the children refused to take off their coats and hats because that was their last link with home. If you took off your coat and hat, you might never get home again. So Edith and her fellow teachers followed the children's lead, and they would let the child play in their hat and coat and place them near an open window. When they fell asleep, they'd move the cot over underneath the open window and place the child onto the cot. Edith said, the teachers did everything they could to make the separation a less painful experience. There was a great deal of holding children in your arms or being very close to them. Throughout her interviews, she talks about comfort coming from human contact, and she was a strong believer in that. Former Bing director Jean Lepper liked to say, nursery school is therapy against the world. And in the Kaiser centers, that meant dealing with separation and the war and building ships in the block corner fully dressed in a hat and coat. In Oregon, everything Edith had learned about early childhood education, informed by her own experience and her time at Merrill Palmer and University of Michigan, coalesced into the principles that still exist as a guide today at Bing. The classroom should be a place that was inviting, that said, come on in. Research and experimentation had a place in the classroom. The classroom was a place where how children learn was paramount, offering them the freedom of movement to pursue what interested them. It was a place where the child was accorded the utmost respect as an honored guest. And it was a place that offered the gift of time to children to make sense of their life, whether the subject was shipbuilding or absent mothers. Between November 1943 and the end of the war in June 1945, the Kaiser Children's Centers cared for 3,811 different children, providing almost 250,000 child care days. They had freed over 2 million women work hours. That's the equivalent of the construction of 6 Liberty ships. When the war ended, literally on the day the war ended, basically, the shipyards closed, the parents left almost instantaneously, and the centers were dismantled. Their level of excellence in daycare has never been matched. But what Edith Dowley saw and learned there would give rise to Bing Nursery School. After the war, Edith returned home to Detroit and the Merrill Palmer Institute. But in 1948, a position opened at Stanford as assistant to Lois Meek Stoles. In addition, the Dowley family had relocated to the Bay Area, which was another incentive. So in the fall of that year, Edith arrived in Palo Alto to work on her PhD and to assist Dr. Stoles in her landmark study about the relationships between veterans and their war-born children. Meanwhile, on the Stanford campus, undergraduate enrollment had doubled in the 2 years immediately after the war, courtesy of the GI Bill. More than half of those 7,200 new undergrads were veterans, and most of them had children under the age of 5. Well, Stanford had to house all these people, so they paid the US Army $1 for the Dibble Army Hospital, which was located on the site of what is now SRI International on Ravenswood Avenue in Menlo Park. And Dibble had served about 16,000 servicemen who had been wounded in the South Pacific during the war. And it was pretty austere. It was a series of nondescript buildings linked by about 5 miles of ramps. Stanford converted it into 300 apartments and 1,500 dormitory beds. In the spring of 1947, a group of veterans who were fathers went to Al Urich, who was, as we're trying to understand, a vice president of the university, asking that a nursery school be set up for their children. Urich didn't know what a nursery school was. So he called the dean of education, John Barkey, and he said he didn't know what a nursery school was either. So he called psychology professor Jack Hilgard, who said, I don't know anything about nursery schools, but I know somebody who does. Just as an aside, obviously not knowing what a nursery school would not have been grounds for being denied admission at Stanford. But the person who did know about nursery schools was Dr. Lois Meek Stoles. So later that year, the Stanford Village Nursery School began in a Quonset hut that had been a dance hall on the grounds of the psychiatric section of Dibble General Hospital. The nursery school opened with 70 children, but enrollment quickly grew to about 100, and eventually an annex was opened on campus for 72 more children. Edith began working at Stanford Village Nursery School as soon as she arrived on campus in the fall of 1948, and shortly after, she was named director. And this is her reading to children at the Stanford Village Nursery School. Now, conditions in Stanford Village weren't quite as primitive as a mining camp, but they were not lavish. For instance, the apartments used kerosene stoves, and there were 2 gas stations at either end of Stanford Village from which the kerosene was gotten. And Edith liked to tell the story that the dramatic play in the nursery school was often about the fetching of more kerosene. The children would grab a bucket and say, "Oh, company is coming, grab the gas can, we have to run down and get more kerosene." In 1963, it became necessary to abandon the Dibble Hospital site because SRI was expanding. It had always been Edith's dream to conceive and design a nursery school as such, not a school set up in a hospital recreation hall or a former art gallery, but a place designed specifically for the education of children and for research, a model school. And she found a champion in Robert Sears, who was a developmental psychologist and dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences, who was eager himself to combine a good preschool with a good research facility. So Stanford found itself setting aside 5 acres on Escondido Road. And about that time, a young man named Peter Bing, who had lived in Stanford Village as a student, went to Dean Sears and said he'd like to give a gift in honor of his father. And what did the university need? And Sears said, "Well, we need a nursery school. I don't suppose you'd be interested in a nursery school." And Peter said, "Well, I wouldn't, but my mother would." So, as we all know, the Bing family provided and continues to provide many funds for the school today, but originally they were for the classrooms and the gardens. And the research space was funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation. By the way, the total cost was $370,000. Bing began as a dream of Edith's, and the dream came true. She said that planning Bing Nursery School was the most exciting and rewarding experience of her professional life. Bing's doors opened in January of 1966, and since then, much of the important research into early childhood development has either started or ended there. Al Bandura on self-efficacy, Mark Lepper on intrinsic motivation, Ellen Markman on the naming explosion, Walter Mischel on delay of gratification, Eleanor Maccabee on gender differences, Don Flavel on the theory of mind, Eve Clark on language, to name just a few. There are so many. More than 10,000 children have run up and down the hills of the play yards as Edith conceived them. 10,000 children on the way to making the world a better place. Today, Bing is considered perhaps the best nursery school in the world. Al Bandura has described it as the gold standard in early education. When Edith arrived at Stanford in 1948, Lois Meek Stoll said she thought she would stay a quarter. She stayed a quarter of a century, retiring in 1975. In 1948, Edith had presented a paper at the annual meeting of the American Psychological Association that read in part, the pioneers in the nursery school field were zealous. They were satisfied with nothing short of the best for the nursery child. They recognized the dignity and worth of every human individual and the importance of his early years of life. She may as well have been describing herself. Thank you so much. And if people have some questions, I'll try to answer them. When I originally wrote the speech, it was an hour and 45 minutes long. I had to cut it back, so. Anybody? Yes?
Who goes to the school? Is it just Stanford people, or who are invited to come?
That's a, Oh, I'm sorry. He wanted to know who attends the school. Is it just Stanford, the children of Stanford students, or anyone? Well, I would probably like Jennifer or Beth to answer this question specifically, but my understanding is that there are a certain percentage of seats reserved for the children of Stanford faculty or graduate students, et cetera. And then there are a certain number of scholarship seats for families who otherwise couldn't afford to attend. And then because I was not affiliated, for instance, with Stanford at all. In fact, it was just one of this, we just recently moved here and I applied, and that's why I say I was so lucky. So then, I don't know what the percentages are for, how many seats are open to the general public. I know that it's become the school that everybody wants to go to because, now it reads like a who's who of Silicon Valley and the children who have attended there, so. Anybody else? Yes.
The Kaiser project was very racially integrated with some racial issues that arose. And they weren't in the pictures, but did Dowley write anything about that, about working with children of different races?
She did not, she talked about it in interviews, she didn't ever wrote anything about it, but it was one of her great disappointments that they were least successful with the African-American women workers in getting them to bring their children to the centers, and it was a great disappointment to her. And, she kind of put it down to a cultural prejudice, and she and the other teachers there made great efforts with outreach, but they were not successful to the extent that they would have liked to have been. One of the things she did write about also, though, was having children, who, handicapped children or children who, who are blind in wheelchairs. Was always a priority for her. And she did it as much as possible at the Kaiser Centers, but then she really made that part of the practice at Bing. To my knowledge, no. There was never anything else like this, of this scale.
Not at this scale, but in Richmond, where Kaiser also had a shipyard, there were like 14 nursery schools, never of the magnitude of the Portland shipyard.
That's correct. The Lanham Act that I talked about that provided funds for the building of nursery schools, but there was never anything on the scale of the order of excellence, and the Kaisers themselves didn't do anything else, to my knowledge.
The Lanham Act nursery school.
Oh, did you? You don't look old enough. No.
One other thing I would add, seeing her face, she hired me in about 1970. One of the things I most remember that was a little weird for some of us teachers when we first heard this, I was in an afternoon class, and she would come to the door before the gate was open, and she would look in the door, and with that face, she would say, "Are you ready for the great event?" I mean, it was stunning. At first, really? Okay. And then it was, no, the more you got to know her, as you have so succinctly talked about, that is what she felt. That's what we should feel as teachers. That's what children.
That's the most marvelous story. I hope everybody heard that. Did everybody hear that story? Oh my gosh, thank you. That is terrific. That's going to end up in the book. Anybody else? One other thing I would like to add is that in an interview with James Himes later, people asked him, why wasn't this model duplicated? Because think how women's lives would be different if we had resources, not even to this extent, but something resembling these resources. And he said that he just believed that it was simply not economically feasible, that these centers, even with Maritime Commission funds, with Kaiser's underwriting, what the parents paid was really insignificant. He said they ran at a deficit at that time of about $680,000 a year, which would be astronomical today. So.
Are you suggesting that the Kaiser project
Oh, no, 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 I was talking about the Kaiser Center, that to duplicate that kind of daycare, that, incredible scope of daycare, and also, again, the excellence of those teachers. That's what Bing has in a microcosm, but it's expensive.
I'm a little torn with that, because I think one of the things that Mr. Kaiser used was his innovation in the building field. You mentioned how he was able to cut back the time and even build a single ship in one day.
Right.
So he was an innovator. That's what allowed him to quickly get the system in place. The U.S. has not saw fit to use automation in building technology.
Yeah,
We're still building with very outmoded technology. So on the building side, we could be more innovative there, and we're not. On the teacher side, I think the real key is her, people like her.
right.
And I think and that energy that you talked about, I don't believe that that's in short supply. I believe that the teaching systems in place are not promoting that.
Well, I would agree with you about that, but it's not in short supply at Bing Nursery School. It continues to be in good supply, that kind of energy and excellence at Bing Nursery School. But I have to say, you have to remember that in terms of the economic cost of running a school like this, that the Kaiser shipyards went bankrupt shortly after the war ended. It was like there was something about the wartime, urgency and the amount of money that the federal government was willing to pour into things like this that made it work for a while and allowed him, to open this amazing physical plant, staffed by the best people in the country in 7 months. But it couldn't be sustained. I'm not enough of an economist to explain it to you, but I think that probably we're not going to see it anytime soon without that sense of urgency.
My kids did co-op preschools, which are play-based, much the same as Bing. And then suddenly there was a swing towards academia, and now that you read a lot in, online and in the papers now about how that's harming the kids, and it's going, is it swinging back to play-based? Does anybody hear the teachers here? No, I mean, I'd like to think it does, but I don't know.
I can just tell you what I'm reading, because I'm doing a lot of research about this, because I think what I'm writing is not a policy book, but obviously the Bing program is play-based, and I am a big believer in play-based education. Also, every piece of neuroscience, psychology, everything is telling you that play is essential to proper development. But I think there's just tremendous pressure from parents that is cramming down academics to the level of 3-year-olds. And you see it, and then, there's just all of this accountability stuff that's still going on despite, No Child Left Behind being criticized and everything else that.
But now you're starting to read criticisms of that more. So I'm just hoping it's for these backup things.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, and when I look at initiatives, because I just get all the listservs and everything and see what's happening kind of state by state, the pressure from parents is to academicize, preschool. And I think only kind of trying to educate parents in ways. Right now, the word really is not out there, I don't think, fully about. Parents are really concerned about their children succeeding, and they see that as being able to read when they're 3 or 4, not as, being able to play allows you to learn how to read really well when you're 5 or 6. But are you seeing the same thing? From your parents? Anybody else?
What demographic of parents is that? Who is that?
Oh, I don't have the knowledge to answer that. Do you?
The demographic of parents that you just talked about.
Who are seeking academics for their children? Yeah, I mean, honestly, everybody. I mean, I think it's middle-class people, it's upper middle-class people who are already thinking about getting their kids into Stanford. But also, I think it's under-resourced families who feel that their kids need to be competitive, and they don't understand the value of play in early childhood education. Again, it's educating the parents is going to be a really important task.
Personally, me from New York, the pressure being perform very well is just extreme. My kids, I have three kids. Two of my kids are in private schools here, and when they were 3 years old, we would have them try reading, and the stress of trying to get them to Montessori program and to learn how to read and write. And at that age, it was a lot of pressure. And I think moving into Palo Alto, you see the culture has totally shifted. And when we found Bing, our son, who is currently at Bing, he is the epitome of the Bing culture. He is free-spirited, he is very opinionated, and he is very confident in who he is. And I had no plan B for him because I knew that he would be very, very happy at home. And right now, I don't really care if he doesn't read or if he's not writing or he's not holding his pencil as he should. I think that his social, emotional well-being at this moment is key to his success.
One of the things that I remember is that Bing does like a kindergarten program for the Bing children who are getting ready to transition the following year. And I don't remember who said this, but I remember they said, if you go to a kindergarten and they start talking about worksheets, run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. And I absolutely followed that advice. I thought it was great advice. I don't imagine you could probably get away with it anymore. That was 25 years ago or 24 years ago. So, no, 20 years ago. Anybody else? Oh. Can you stand up? I'm sorry. Or come down to the microphone. I'm sorry.
I'll just speak louder.
Okay.
When they were building the Kaiser School, was it Edith's idea for all the child size things and based on research, or did you say it was Kaiser's idea?
There's no question it was Edith's idea. And in fact, the architectural firm, she sat down with them and laid out very carefully what she wanted, and they came back with a plan that did not include what she had asked for. And a young architect who was on the team took her aside and said, I can do what you want, because she had rejected it. And it was this young architect, whose name is not going to come to me at the moment, who brought back the plan as Edith had basically laid it out for them. And if you look at what Kaiser was like, you can see that she took those ideas and translated them into a research facility, and one handling fewer children at the time too. They were handling 1,000 children a day at Kaiser. So it was Edith, no question. Anybody else?
Last question. I had something. Our son graduated from Bing in 1973. He attended a sequence of 5 other schools after that. After he got his JD degree from Northwestern School of Law, he was interviewing for a law clerk job, and somehow the question came up of which nursery school. And the judge, the circuit court judge, this was in Oregon, knew about Bing because the previous law clerk had gone there. We all decided that it was more important not which law school you went to, but which nursery.
The perfect note to end on. Thank you.
Well, please join me in giving another round of applause for Christine and that wonderful presentation. My name is Troy Steinmetz. I am the president of the Stanford Historical Society, and we were delighted to be a part of bringing this important story to the table. And I think I can join everyone in the room saying, I learned something new, I laughed, I was intrigued, and as we can tell today, it sparked off a whole conversation that we'll get to continue afterward with a reception in the lobby. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to Jennifer and everyone at Bing, to obviously to Christine, to Charlotte, Suzanne Abel, everyone at the Historical Society Programs Committee who were a part of pulling this event together. The Stanford Historical Society, we are a member-supported, volunteer-driven organization committed to the study and preservation of Stanford history. And when you think about that, it's really telling the stories of Stanford, including the organization, the place, and the people, both grand and small. And so the ability to hear those stories and to share them with one another are really what we're about. If you'd like to learn more about joining the Historical Society, just in time for our members meeting in May, celebrating art and museums at Stanford, you can let me know or visit us out in the lobby. But thank you again for your attention. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We're delighted to have you all here, and we'll see you in the reception.